At this point in the fantasy season, you need to be looking at the waiver wire a different way. If you've got an underperforming player for the past several weeks, you need to try to move on and cut the fat off of your team, because there are late season breakouts at this point that maybe weren't the greatest players at the beginning of the year, but they're coming into their own right now, and there are some late season breakouts that have opportunities opened up for them. So make sure to go down there, drop a like on this video, and subscribe to the channel to show your support as we go through these breakouts on the Week 10 waiver wire. Starting out with our guy that we need to just check to make sure that he's not on waiver wires right now. Jonathan Brooks is 58.7% rostered. Now let me tell you my thing with Jonathan Brooks. Jonathan Brooks, I've never been a big Jonathan Brooks guy. I do not personally believe that he's going to take over this backfield in Carolina. When you're looking at Chuba Hubbard, the way that he has performed for them, and when you couple the fact that the Panthers were getting trade offers for Chuba Hubbard, you might ask yourself, why didn't they trade this guy? Well, it's very simple. Dave Canales wants to win freaking football games, and this guy gives him a good opportunity to win football games. He's been a really good player for them, and at this point is their best offensive playmaker, especially without Deontay Johnson. This guy wants to keep Chuba Hubbard because he's helping him win football games. Jonathan Brooks hasn't played in over a year at this point in actual football, and who's to say that he comes back in and he's better than Chuba Hubbard already? That's a really big stretch the way Chuba Hubbard's been playing, so I don't personally think that Jonathan Brooks has tons of upside, but here's the way you need to look at this one. You ready? You need to be looking at Jonathan Brooks as a good sell high target, because there's lots of fantasy creators out there who are big on Jonathan Brooks, and I believe they're off the mark. So this has driven up his value in some leagues in fantasy football. I think he's a good trade piece, a good sell high piece, rather than a guy that I think that you should just keep and just absolutely bank on the fact that it'll become flexible or starter worthy here in a little bit. This reminds me of Jameson Williams in his rookie year when he ended up doing nothing. I don't think Jonathan Brooks is going to be the guy in Carolina. I think it's Chuba Hubbard's backfield still. And of course, we need to address who we should drop for this guy. I think that you could be dropping a guy like Zach Moss still. Zach Moss is just, at this point, not only just not the better running back in Cincinnati, but they have made the clear shift that it is not his backfield anymore. It is Chase Brown's backfield. Now, granted, he missed a Week 9's game versus the Raiders, so it's not fair to just say, like, yeah, Chase Brown took it all. Zach Moss was out of the lineup in that game, but still, if you look over the past several weeks, the past month, basically, this backfield has been all Chase Brown. Zach Moss is not relevant anymore, and again, you just need to clear space for a guy who, yes, was producing in the first month of the fantasy season. It's over at this point. And same thing with Tyjae Spears. To be honest with you, Tyjae Spears, I can see him coming back and providing you some sort of fantasy value when he's actually healthy again. But the problem is not that. The problem is Tony Pollard has really taken a real stranglehold on this backfield. So I don't personally think that Tyjae Spears is just going to come back in and make this a split of somehow, some sort. I don't think that's going to be the case. I think you can comfortably move on from Tyjae Spears because I don't think he has much trade value either way as well on the trade market if your trade deadline has not even happened yet. Now, here's the guys that we just got to claim. These are our shot takers, and I think there are late season breakouts in this group. Cedric Tillman, Quentin Johnston, Taysom Hill, Cedric Wilson Jr., Jalen Tolbert, Ray McLeod, Jalen Coker, Parker Washington, and Ricky Pearsall. Cedric Tillman, 47.8% roster. Last week was a good time to pick up Cedric Tillman. If you did and you played him, he actually did much better than I thought he was going to do this week against the Chargers defense here. Cedric Tillman has been really freaking good over the past 4 weeks or so. He's actually the wide receiver 6, believe it or not, over the last 4 week span. He's been really good in fantasy football. Cedric Tillman is a very sustainable player at this point because when you look at Jameis Winston and how they performed specifically against the Chargers, that was a really tough matchup right there. That was not the same as taking on the Ravens a couple weeks back when Cedric Tillman got 2 touchdowns. They played a much stouter defense versus the wide receiver position, and Cedric Tillman still performed really well in fantasy football. This is a late season breakout right here. Someone who's not only just a sell high candidate potentially, this is a guy who can go into your flex consistently. This is a really good breakout candidate at this point because he doesn't have any competition as a wide receiver one. Judy's hit or miss, and Elijah Moore stinks. And Jameis Winston is definitely going to be providing upside in fantasy football moving forward. So I think Cedric Tillman is your priority number one this week at the wide receiver position. I think Quentin Johnston is a really good late season breakout candidate. This guy was injured the past several weeks with an ankle injury. But if you actually look at what he did before he left with the ankle injury, he was starting to come on as well. They were using him more down the field. They were actually opening up the field for him. They were using him as he should have been used last year. And Quentin Johnston at this point just looks like he may not be a bust anymore in football. So again, in this game against the Browns, he ends up having it's more than just the big play that he ended up getting. He had 4 catches for 120 yards in this game. Quentin Johnston is being used more effectively, and it's also good because Justin Herbert has thrown for a bunch more yards over the past 3 weeks or so than he did all of the first month of the season. They're opening up the field again with Justin Herbert. Quentin Johnston is 21% rostered. This is a guy, again, to take the shot on because he is going to be a potential late season breakout at this point. Taysom Hill, I will say this. I actually want to give someone really big credit because before the Sunday games on my live stream, somebody was saying in the chat, I think Taysom Hill's going to break out this week. And I said, I'm not predicting it. It may be, it may happen. I'm just not predicting it this week. Taysom Hill had the breakout game. He ran in a touchdown and he ended up having 4 catches for 40 yards. Taysom Hill will do this for you 1 to 2 more times in this season. And it may even be more because Chris Olave, I think what we're about to see with Chris Olave, if you did not see, he went down with a brutal concussion after basically getting sandwiched between 2 defenders yesterday. I think what we're about to see with Chris Olave is him go into a Tua situation where he's about to get put on the IR. This is his second concussion, I think, in 3 weeks or so. So Chris Olave, I don't think we're going to see him anytime soon. So there's going to be someone like a Cedric Wilson Jr. on the Saints as well. That's why he's on this list as well. Because if you looked at the stats from Sunday's game versus the Carolina Panthers, Cedric Wilson Jr. was the second best receiver in this group. Now, you may be asking, what about Bud Means? Well, Bud Means just got put on the IR as well. So they're depleted at the wide receiver position in New Orleans here. But I will definitely say this. Cedric Wilson Jr. will get his opportunities over the next several weeks. But so will Taysom Hill. Taysom Hill, this is when he comes into play. If there's an Alvin Kamara missing, or a Chris Olave missing, or another wide receiver like a Rashid Shaheed missing, this is where we start to see more of Taysom Hill get his work in. So Taysom Hill, 26.8% rostered. Obviously, this guy is going to be able to go in as a flex tight end. Depending on where you play fantasy football, he will be viable in those certain positions. And Cedric Tillman will be a pure wide receiver flex. I think that there's opportunities being opened up here in New Orleans because, again, Bub Means is on the IR, which means that it's Cedric Wilson Jr., and if Chris Olave comes back, it's him as well. I think we're about to see an NFL style go into the IR because it's his second big concussion in the last several weeks. I don't think we're going to see Olave for a while now. Jalen Tolbert, I think, is also a really good pickup as well. 22.8% rostered, and CeeDee Lamb at the end of that game, he did leave, and then he came back. But here's the deal. After the game, they said that they were going to give him an MRI on a sprained AC joint. So if he's at all missing time for the next several weeks, Jalen Tolbert's the clear-cut best option in that wide receiver room. This guy's actually been pretty playable for the majority of the year. He doesn't have a stable floor, though, because obviously CeeDee Lamb is the target hog there. So if CeeDee Lamb were to miss any time whatsoever, Jalen Tolbert goes from playable and flexible to basically a must-start option. Dak has been bad this year, but he's been good enough to support fantasy options at the wide receiver position. I believe Jalen Tolbert's a good potential late-season breakout candidate as well, depending on how much time CeeDee Lamb misses, if any at all. Ray McLeod, also, I do think could potentially be in that same light. Obviously, Darnell Mooney becomes the wide receiver one if Drake London misses extended time with the hip injury that kept him out of the majority of that game versus the Cowboys here. But Ray McLeod is 13.3% rostered, and he has had plenty of games himself where he's actually been really relevant in fantasy as well. Ray McCloud, if Drake London misses, definitely goes to a wide receiver 2 role, and Darnell Mooney obviously becomes the wide receiver 1. Mooney is the better option, obviously, at the wide receiver position if he does miss time. But Ray McCloud in this offense with Kirk Cousins, Kirk is absolutely good enough to supply 2 wide receivers in fantasy football. So if Drake London were to miss extended time here, you definitely want to pick up Ray McCloud off the waiver wire. And same thing, and I will say this, I'm not super wild on Jalen Coker here. He's obviously the number 2 wide receiver in Carolina. He's 4.6% roster, but without Deontay Johnson, there's definitely been long-term opportunities opened up here. And Bryce Young has been playing better. Like, it's been better than it was that first, couple games of the year when he was a absolute train wreck disaster. It's not been that bad lately. So Jalen Coker, I do think, is a potentially good play in fantasy football in certain weeks. If you're in deeper leagues, this one's more for you. If you've got 14, 16 team leagues, or if you've just got like 10 bench spots and can afford to take a shot on one of these deeper guys, I think Jalen Coker is actually you could do a lot worse than Jalen Coker off the waiver wire as well. Parker Washington, 3.9% roster. Jacksonville, one thing was clear. Number 1, Trevor Lawrence sucks. I mean, let's just address reality. This guy stinks, and he's not worth his money. But it's obvious, though, that they need help. Like, Brian Thomas Jr. is not fully healthy. He had a bad game against the Eagles here. Evan Ingram still is just not getting the job done to the tune of what we need him to. Parker Washington did get targets and receptions in that game. And I said it before the game. Parker Washington is not going to be a big play threat. That's not what he is. That's why he's not higher on this list. What Parker Washington is just a consistent target guy. He's a low-end Christian Kirk. That's what he is. He's not as big of a play threat as Christian Kirk, but he's also good enough to get you those shorter routes. And if targeted at a high level, he definitely will be able to provide you upside, specifically in a PPR format. So with Parker Washington here, I do think that he is viable in those deeper leagues again as well. And even in some 12-team leagues, I can definitely see merit here that Parker Washington gets more opportunities in the future. And then Ricky Pearsall, do not forget about him. He's coming off the bye week, and he's only 18.4% rostered. It actually went down from a week ago because he was on the bye week and people dropped him. There's still no Brandon Ayuk, so that's obviously a major issue for the 49ers. But that opens up the opportunity, and Deebo Samuel has just been in and out of the lineup here. Ricky Pearsall is absolutely going to serve a role in this offense. And obviously, Juwan Jennings obviously comes into effect as well, but Ricky Pearsall is going to have his role. He may as well become the Juwan Jennings from before when Brandon Ayuk wasn't hurt. So I think Ricky Pearsall is basically set in stone to have a role in this offense at this point. And then here's guys that we need to just make the business decision on and decide to drop and go with the upside that is there on the waiver wire. Caleb Williams, Dontavian Wicks, Elijah Moore, Trey Tucker, and Devin Singletary. Caleb Williams, just make an executive decision here, because this guy, like, Caleb Williams has flat out not been good enough in his rookie year. And I think he's got no help offensively either. I think his coaching staff stinks. But the reality is fantasy football stats don't care about that. Fantasy football, he has not been good coming out of the bye. And if you actually look back to when he was playing well out of the bye, they were playing disaster teams. Like, they were playing the Panthers. They were playing other bad teams that they absolutely should have been beating. So hindsight's 20/20 to me on this one, because if he had been playing these teams before the bye week and then come out of the bye week and did this, then I would be singing a much different tune. But I think it's obvious at this point, coming out of the bye week, that he is just simply not good enough and simply not in the same freaking stratosphere as Jayden Daniels is at this point as rookies. Dontavian Wicks, listen, I think Dontavian Wicks will have better weeks again. I think he's a boomer bust player that is he's like Christian Watson, right? There will be weeks where he does give you good points. But the truth is, to me, I think that there's certain options on this list that are just going to be much more consistent than he is and much more playable on a weekly basis. Cedric Tillman, Quentin Johnston, I think that those two particular guys are guys that I would much rather count on a weekly basis to go into my lineup personally. Elijah Moore, I think a lot of people got overzealous on this one last week with Cleveland. I didn't say to pick up Elijah Moore. I never liked the player, and he went right back to reality this past week. I think just go ahead and cut bait with him because he's not going to be sustainable in fantasy. Trey Tucker, in Las Vegas, they're a disaster. If you don't have Jacoby Myers, do not worry about a wide receiver over in Las Vegas. And then Devin Singletary. At this point, it's Tyrone Tracy Jr.'s backfield in New York. That's just the reality of the situation here. So while he may provide handcuff upside right here, this guy has just not been very good for the Giants. And Tyrone Tracy Jr. is just flat out a much better player. And then here's my 2 running backs you need to go for. Trey Benson and Isaac Guerendo still. Trey Benson did start to actually show his face for the Arizona Cardinals here. Now, if you remember, Trey Benson was a day 2 pick for the Arizona Cardinals in the 2024 draft. He has not done much up to this point in the season, but they started to use him, and not just late in the game. They were using him early in the game. He ended up getting in the end zone and getting reception work as well. Trey Benson had his first really good game in fantasy football. I'm not saying he's taking over the backfield. That's not what I'm saying at all. But if you are a James Conner owner and you do need a handcuff here, I believe there was a reason they were using him more so this week. When you look back at the history of James Conner, he usually does miss a couple games in a fantasy season the last several years at least. So with James Conner here, I do think if you are a James Conner owner, you can do a really opportunistic move here and grab Trey Benson off the waiver wire and drop another running back that we'll go through here in a little bit. And then I'll say this, I'm still picking up Isaac Guerendo. Listen, we don't know much about the developments of Jordan Mason's injury and Christian McCaffrey's injury because they were obviously on a bye week. Christian McCaffrey here, I'm still reading like non-committal stories about Christian McCaffrey from 49ers websites. They're saying, yeah, we hope, he's going to come back this week. There's no clarification yet. And there's none on Jordan Mason either. I think you'd be missing out on an opportunity here if you didn't pick up Isaac Guerendo this week. Just keep an eye on this one, if nothing else, because if Jordan Mason misses and Christian McCaffrey, Isaac Guerendo is going to handle a bunch of work in the San Francisco backfield, and I think you could drop Ty Chandler for these types of guys. Ty Chandler, at this point, it's just not working out in Minnesota. It's all Aaron Jones there. So let me know how your team did in Week 9. And we've got a big video coming up later on today to help you prepare for Week 10 fantasy football. So stay tuned for that video.